31 years as a federal agent, counterintelligence officer, and counterterrorism operator. Following September 11th, 2001, he was appointed head of the Criminal Investigations Task Force that was mandated to investigate and prosecute members of al-Qaeda, the Taliban, and other individuals. And it was in this role that he disclosed the use of harsh interrogation techniques by US government agencies at Guantanamo. Mark.
Thank you so much. It's an honor to be here, and I'm actually humbled to be here with my colleagues here to share with you at least some of my experiences over the years. While I spent 31 years with the United States government, I speak to you now not as an official of that government, but as a citizen of that republic, a citizen deeply concerned with both the national security of the United States, but also global security, which is tied to stability throughout the world. The country that I come from, the United States, is founded on some distinct principles of inalienable rights, rights that may not be abridged by neither man nor government. And on September 17th, we just celebrated the anniversary last week, 1787, George Washington was the first person to sign a document, the Constitution of the United States. 38 others of our founding fathers signed that document. And then not too long after that, not too far from here, in Federal Hall in Lower Manhattan, George Washington stood up as the first person to raise his right hand and swear an allegiance to protect, preserve, and defend that Constitution, what it embodies, what it stands for, a Constitution based on human rights, a country founded upon those human rights. And I have sworn that oath as well. And while I retired from the United States government in 2010, no one has told me that I don't have to adhere to those rights anymore. So I speak to you today as someone with great concern and great passion about some of the things that we've done that have brought us here today, and with great anticipation for what is going on here with you folks. It's very commendable. So again, I'm honored and humbled to be here. The events of September 11th were the most certainly cataclysmic in my lifetime. Shortly thereafter, on September 17th, 214 years to the day that Constitution was signed, President George Bush, who also, as the 43rd President of the United States, raised his right hand and swore to protect, defend, and preserve that Constitution, authorized the Central Intelligence Agency to commit a program called the RDI program, rendition, detention, and interrogation. None of those things were core competencies of the Central Intelligence Agency. And that agency, and those decisions were made out of fear and frankly ignorance, as well as arrogance. And shortly thereafter, the CIA created a program called the EIT program. They called it the Enhanced Interrogation Program, but there was nothing enhanced about it. Those unjustifiable means that they established, the EIT program, were frankly nothing more than an excuse to inflict torture. And when President George Washington, when he was a general, was confronted with sending forces to protect the United States against British forces in Canada, he had to make a decision. And he wasn't a general at the time, he was a colonel, Benedict Arnold. He gave him a charge, and he wrote a letter to him. And he said, if any soldier is so base as to harm a prisoner, then bring him to such justice that is considerate with the crime, up to death. And he said that if someone does that, they will bring great shame and disgrace upon both this country and themselves. And that's just what we did with the EIT program. So I welcome your questions.
Last time you spoke, you also used that example of Washington, and I was very happy to go down to Washington, D.C. a week later and tell it to 500 people who were not aware of it. I think it's a very important point. Mark, so if you had the type of research findings that are available today, would that have made a difference with the decision-making processes that resulted in the enhanced interrogation techniques program after 9/11?
I think it might have. The challenge I had when I saw this program gravitating, going from the CIA to the Department of Defense, whom I work for at Guantanamo, I challenged it back in 2002, and I was arguing against the unknown. And so I was arguing based on my experiences, and I had been involved in terrorist investigations since the 90s, and particularly al-Qaeda, so it wasn't something that I lacked experience in. But when I tried to argue that my experiences should be recognized because we had effectively elicited accurate and reliable, not just evidence, but intelligence, both, from terrorist suspects that helped our national security and helped the justice system. We had been able to try terrorists in what we call Article III courts, constitutional courts in the United States. But when I was arguing, I didn't have the research that is available today. So I would argue that it is not effective, but I couldn't base that on science. I could base it on experience. Today, fortunately, we have an enormous body of work, evidence-based research. I don't want to say a fortunate dividend, but a byproduct of U.S. torture has been that when President Obama took office, he established a program to actually do research. And even under President Bush, we had determined that it had been 50 years before the United States had actually sponsored any research into how we were trying to elicit information from people. And since that time, since President Obama took office and they established this research program, there's been more than 100 research studies done, all unclassified, peer-reviewed, that have told us now that they verified my instincts. They verified what human rights have told us. They verified what we find out as police officers through trial and error, that if you're coercive or if you're abusive, you might get information, but it may be the information you want, but it may not necessarily be the truth. And so what we found is that the coercive techniques sometimes do produce a confession from the guilty. Unfortunately, they do produce confessions from the innocent as well. But even if they do produce information from the guilty, it produces less information. So it produces less intelligence or less corroborable facts or less things to research to corroborate. So if this came again today, we have now research to help back the practitioners who were against this to start with. The folks who designed that program weren't interrogation professionals. They were clinical psychologists who had no experience in al-Qaeda, had no interrogation experience, and it was voodoo science.
Indeed. You've spoken in the past of being confronted by people who say that, look, we must torture suspects because al-Qaeda would have done that to us. How would you respond to people who say that, yeah, okay, well, we accept that torture is abhorrent, but nevertheless it's a necessary evil because we have to extract the information? How do you in your field do you deal with people like that?
Often. People try to say, but in the interest of national security, shouldn't we do this? What we have to recognize is that torture produces corrupted information. And I'll use an example because the UN is involved in this example. So after 9/11, there was an emir of an al-Qaeda training camp named Ibn Sheikh al-Libi. And al-Libi was rendered to another country and was tortured. And al-Libi was one of the individuals who said there was al-Qaeda in Iraq. And having worked al-Qaeda since the 90s, when I heard that information, it just makes no sense. There is no logical conclusion to that. I had 200 investigators on the ground in Afghanistan, later in Iraq, at Guantanamo Bay. It wasn't tracking with any of the information we had, any of the information from the Cole attack, any information from the case in the 90s. I worked with the blind Sheikh Omar Abdul-Rahman, and they wanted to blow up this very building here that we're in back in the 90s. So it didn't track. And that information was used to support policy decisions. Colin Powell came here before the United Nations, and part of the justification for the war in Iraq was based on the fact that someone said there was al-Qaeda in Iraq. And President Bush went to Cincinnati, Ohio, and convinced the American public that there was al-Qaeda in Iraq based on false and fabricated information. So it's more than ineffective, it's counterproductive, because it produces flawed decisions, and we've lost lives because of those flawed decisions. So it's just not a viable technique to practice.
Thank you very much indeed. Those are strong arguments. Our fourth panelist is from Brazil, Dr. Lilian Stein.